Good morning. This hearing will come to order. American consumers today are rightly worried about inflation and rising prices for the goods they buy. Today, we're going to talk about a hidden fee that fuels the fires of inflation across America every day. What they may not know is that this swipe fee is contributing to the problem of inflation. When swipe fees on credit and debit cards go up, as they just recently did, it increases inflation, and consumers ultimately pay the price. Ironically, this journey for me started in this very room 16 years ago. Arlen Specter was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He called a hearing on swipe fees and interchange fees. I attended because I was not familiar with those terms. And I heard for the first time what a swipe fee was, and the fact that when I used my debit card and credit card, a swipe fee was being charged to the retailer that I was ultimately paying. And then I learned that there was virtually no negotiation in those fees. Retailers were at the mercy of the credit cards and banks in terms of what those fees would be. There was no competition because we have a duopoly here, well represented at this table, and that created a situation where the market forces really don't work. They're not supposed to work. They're not designed to work. And what's happened in America, we all know. The statistics on the amount of Americans paying with plastic tell the story. These are from 2020. I'm sure after the pandemic and our change in lifestyle, they're even greater. The number of 2020 transactions involving debit cards, 86 billion. The amount involving credit cards, 41 billion. Between the two, credit and debit cards, in 2020, 127 billion transactions in America. Well, how are we doing with cash transactions? 32.8 billion. How about the use of a check? 5 billion. So we're becoming a nation that clearly, maybe even a world, that pays with plastic. And today we're going to ask a few questions about how those payments are made and the charges that are imposed. This committee held a hearing with witnesses from Visa and MasterCard 16 years ago to discuss anti-competitive fees. We're back. Here's what I've learned. Visa and MasterCard control about 80% of the credit and debit card market. They've established a system of fees and rules that apply to every transaction of the billions I just mentioned, involving cards used by thousands of banks. Each time a credit or debit card is used, Visa and MasterCard charge fees that take a cut out of the transaction. You don't see it on the check at the restaurant. It's there. Some of that cut they keep for themselves. Most of it's given to the bank that issued the card. The fee that Visa and MasterCard require the merchant to pay to the card issuing bank is called an interchange fee. It's usually charged as a percentage of the transaction plus a flat fee. For example, 2% plus 10 cents per transaction. That means when a card transaction of $100 is made, the merchant gets less than $98 after the fees are deducted. And merchants end up raising the prices of their products to make up for the deducted fees. You might ask, how much have Americans been charged in interchange fees by Visa and MasterCard since that hearing 16 years ago in 2006? According to payments consultant CMSPI, it's $794 billion, all built into the prices retailers have to charge and consumers have to pay. Interchange fees are designed to avoid competitive market pressures. Banks get the fees, but banks do not set the fees. Instead, the banks let Visa and MasterCard set the fees on their behalf. So the same schedule of fee rates applies for all banks in the network. This means that all banks in the network are guaranteed the same interchange fee, regardless of how efficient or inefficient the bank is in running a card operation or preventing fraud. It's a gravy train. When Visa and MasterCard raise interchange fees, banks want to issue more cards because they make more on each swipe. And Visa and MasterCard profit when there are more swipes because they take their own cut, called a network fee, from the merchant on each swipe. But merchants and their customers take it on the chin, and we're going to hear that firsthand today. What can merchants do to try to keep the fee rates down? Not much. Visa and MasterCard are the negotiating agents for thousands of banks, If a merchant wants to be able to accept payment from those banks' customers, they have to agree to Visa and MasterCard's fees and terms. I remember at that hearing 16 years ago, at that table, one of the customers, or one of the retailers, had a stack about 3 inches tall. They had asked for a copy of the contractual agreement with Visa and MasterCard when it came to imposing fees. They quickly said, this isn't the complete contract. They would only give us part of it, 3 or 4 inches tall. And you expect a grocery store, a restaurant, to go through all this? Bottom line, when fees go up, it costs more to use money. And that cost gets billed into prices consumers pay. Visa and MasterCard raised their swipe fees 2 weeks ago, despite bipartisan opposition from Congress. It was obvious. We're suffering from inflation. Don't raise these hidden fees again. They did it anyway. Senator Marshall and I, Representatives Welsh and Van Dyne, urged them not to do it. They didn't listen, and we'll talk about it today. The credit and debit card systems are not competitive marketplaces. When you don't have real competition, what happens? You get higher costs, less innovation, weaker security. And new potential competitors get stifled. It's a sweetheart deal for the dominant networks, for the biggest banks, and for certain cardholders who have ritzy rewards programs. But the average small business and the consumer, they pay the price. Other countries have figured this out, incidentally. You can't have a fair system when you let networks fix the swipe fees without competition or regulation. So the European Union, Australia, China, India, Israel, South Korea, and more have stepped up to create reasonable swipe fee limits. We have the Durbin Amendment that applies only to debit cards. In 2010, I wrote that law that placed reasonable limits on debit interchange fees that Visa and MasterCard fixed on behalf of big banks. It has generated a lot of talk over the last few years and a lot of TV commercials. And boy, the big banks hate the Durbin Amendment like the devil hates holy water. In the absence of competitive marketplace, there needs to be some limit on Visa and MasterCard's fee fixing. Here's a few steps I'd like to suggest. Let's have transparency and make it clear to consumers in their monthly statements how much of their card purchases are being deducted as interchange fees. You know you have the information, and you know you can provide it. Maybe if consumers knew how much of their cards were costing their favorite restaurants and retailers, they'd use less costly cards. Second, let's stop the practice of charging swipe fees on the part of the transaction amount that is sales tax. That's a swipe tax on top of a sales tax. Give the consumers a break. Let's stop the exclusivity deals where Visa and MasterCard tell banks they can't use any other network on their cards. Let's give merchants a choice of card network options on each swipe and each online sale. Let's make sure that someone besides the dominant network plays a role in setting security standards for cards. Security innovators and startups are being shut out of the current system. And let's reduce inflationary pressure by preventing network fixed swipe fees from being jacked up to unreasonable levels. We got a lot to talk about today. We're joined by a distinguished panel. I thank them for joining this spirited discussion. And let me turn to Senator Grassley.